Hi, welcome to this tutorial. In this video, I want to share the process I've been going through so far with my environment piece. I quickly wanted to reiterate the first steps. We previously went through 4 rough blockouts and to try and decide what direction to go for. We chose number 4 because the composition was best fitting to show the mining town and how it was built on the cliff sides and pipes. So I basically went ahead and detailed it further, keeping in mind that it has to be colorful and hopeful. I made the blockout using mainly cubes and cylinders, and I made a quick canyon in Gaia as a base for the terrain. So now it's time to put some details and life to the scene. The first thing I want to do is replace all the primitive shapes with actual assets. So I made various houses to scatter in the scene later on. The way I go about this is that I found a spot outside the scene where I can start modeling my assets. I'm using references from westerns and shanty towns, and I start modeling the overall shapes of the house first, and then I gradually add details. I then use some kitbash sets to add some more detailed parts such as the engines, electric boxes, ventilation, pipes and satellite dishes. At this stage, I also want to point out that it's important to know what your assets will be used for and make sure you spend the right amount of time on them. For example, in this case, I knew that these houses would mostly be seen from afar, so I kept the details fairly large, like big pipes and big mechanical parts. I didn't go in there and model all the small machine parts. I didn't add like interior sets, and I didn't add tiny details. This way I could save time, so I could focus on making more house variations instead. When I was happy with my house variations, I made sure that they were all in their own collections in Blender, and I marked them all as assets. I was then able to find them in my asset library and use those to populate the scene. There's a few reasons why I think this is a nice way to go about it, and here are 2 advice from my experience. It's overall lighter for the scene. The assets are instances of the actual model, and therefore they don't take up as much space as if you were just duplicating the house throughout the scene. And if you want to make changes to your asset later on in the process, you just have to change the initial model and it will automatically update all the instances in the scene. In my case, for example, I finished building the whole town when I realized it was feeling a bit dead without the lights inside the houses. So I went back into my initial models. I just added some point lights inside them and the whole town got lit up in a few minutes. Making assets out of your models is also a great way to share them across different scenes, and it's a fast way for you and your coworkers to share the work between each other. In my scene, for example, I've used the bikes and the background tower from Andreas, and in this way it's helping our scenes and our world look more coherent. When I'm happy with the result of my scene, it's time to do a final render and get some passes out that I can use in Photoshop afterwards. I just want to give you a quick rundown of the steps that I usually take. In the render properties, I want to put the max samples to 128, and I want to deactivate denoise. The output properties, I want to up the resolution to get a more crisp image. Here I put it at 300%. And in the layer properties, I want to make sure that I activate normals, denoising data, ambient occlusion, and cryptomatte object. Then I go to the compositing tab. Here I want to make sure that use nodes is activated. And then I want to create a file output node. In the properties for this node, I want to make sure that I have the right file path, where all my render passes basically will be saved. I want to make sure that it's set to RGB, and I want to add the different inputs for the different passes. So here the final image, the normal pass, ambient occlusion, and a cryptomatte. And yeah, it basically looks like this. You just connect the different outputs here to the different inputs, and then you're ready to press F12 and all your images will be saved out automatically to the folder that you've selected. At the time of this video, I'm currently working on my image in Photoshop. I'll be going more in depth with that part of the process in the next video, but for now I can share my typical workflow when I start this process. The first thing I want to do is have all my render passes from Blender. And here they are. This is the final render. This is the cryptomatte. This is the normals, and this is the ambient occlusion. I usually store them at the top of my layer stack in a folder so I can find them easily again later. Then it's time to work on the values. It's great to make a 3D scene to get a highly detailed environment, and it's good for lighting, but as you can see from my render, I haven't spent much time doing proper value separations in Blender. So this is a step I prefer doing in Photoshop. as it gives me more artistic control over the image. This is where the Cryptomatte pass helps a lot. In my workflow, I like to separate the elements of my image into different layers so I can adjust the values individually and add volumetric fog between them if needed. For this, I use the magic wand on the Cryptomatte to start selecting the objects in the image, and I use Ctrl-Shift-J to cut them into their own layer. A quick note is to be aware that the Cryptomatte also has a lot of white objects in there, so it's not a perfect way to cut out your layers, but at least it helps to make the process a bit faster. And yeah, going forward, I'll be adding photo bashing and I'll be painting to make the scene look more natural and hopefully remove a bit of that 3D feel that it currently has.